How does one judge a movie's success? Everybody has their own metric for whether or not a film resonates with them. Maybe it features the most robust of editing, the tightest of scripts, or the strongest performances. In terms of trade publications and studios, their primary metrics for success have been theatrical box office earnings. These earnings are the ticket sales a film receives from theaters, determining how much revenue a film has produced. The publication Variety began publishing box office earnings in 1922, and continues the practice to this very day. And nowadays, there are numerous online publications devoted to tracking the box office grosses, such as Box Office Mojo. But really though, in the grand scheme of talking about what makes films good or bad, the box office numbers are minuscule in their insight. When it comes to talking about film and its qualities, box office numbers do not matter.
It's not about money, it's about sending a message.
Now, when I say the box office numbers do not matter, I don't mean they matter to nobody. They obviously matter to the filmmakers and the studio. A successful box office gross can lead to more films for a director or a continuation of a franchise. A box office hit means better success for a studio and also determines their future slate. But those numbers only matter to those involved with the business and have a career at stake in it. If you are not a filmmaker, producer, studio executive, or shareholder, then really, what value does the box office gross have for you? Well, for some, box office grosses often become shorthand for trying to stress whether a film is good or bad. And really, this is such an arbitrary angle to stress. I mean, does a film really need to make a lot of money to be considered good? A perfect example of the box office not determining the quality or even popularity of a film can be seen in 1994's The Shawshank Redemption. This prison drama is greatly revered today and has become so mainstream that it has been parodied numerous times. But it wasn't a hit at the theaters. The film cost $25 million to make and only had a box office gross of $16 million, due to the film's marketing and disinterest by audiences amid more popular films. It was only through VHS rentals and numerous reruns on cable that people started to widely recognize the film as a great prison escape movie. So with this in mind, think about this. When did you ever hear someone cite Shawshank's box office to justify why that movie was terrible? And if you did hear that argument, would you care? Would it really change your mind about the quality of the movie? More people talk about the film nowadays for the performances of Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman. They talk about its effective use of narration to portray the closed nature of men in prison. They talk about the iconic shots of Robin playing music over the speaker, the guards discovering his tunnel hidden behind a poster, and the escape into the rain. Nobody talks about the film being bad because it didn't sell enough tickets. Nobody cares about that anymore because most people who catch the film on cable or happen to find it on a streaming channel are not furiously looking up its box office numbers to decide whether or not the movie is good. And yet, there are many people who use the box office as a means to gauge a film's worth. Some people like to cite a box office bomb when talking about a lesser film. Some people will often tack on the box office as a factor. But really, these citations more or less address a film's popularity than it does the quality. Now, the quality might have been poor enough to lead to bad word of mouth, and that could have led to poor ticket sales. Such causation is usually speculated by such statements of poor box office returns. The problem is that people only seem to want to talk about the low box office results for a terrible film. How often do you hear someone talk about the bad box office of a good film as a counter? Let's use Mad Max Fury Road as an example. Fury Road is a damn good movie, but that film actually lost somewhere between $20 and $40 million when comparing the box office gross to the budget. And have you noticed how barely anyone talks about this? It's because there are so many other remarkable things to note about Fury Road. There's so much fascinating material to observe in its blunt messaging, stylish direction, and the exciting convoy chase that something as arbitrary as box office losses are the least interesting thing about the film. Also, box office grosses don't really work here in justifying a film's popularity either. Fury Road had a loss, and yet it was still greatly revered and even parodied in Space Jam 2. And while we're talking about Space Jam 2, we should also bring up that it references The Iron Giant, a film that failed at the box office but has gained enough of a following to appear in 2 Warner Brothers films, the other one being Ready Player One. The box office losses for Fury Road and The Iron Giant mean nothing when compared to how those films were made and why they hold up so well. The most interesting thing I've seen with box office numbers was a podcast betting pool. A host of critics and writers made educated guesses about upcoming films. They then placed bets on which films would perform better than others on certain weekends. But this really isn't film critique. It's a game. It's the same deal with Rotten Tomatoes percentage predictions. It doesn't prove whether or not the film is good in terms of how it was made. It mostly just proves how much of a trend you can spot. And I'm sorry, but argument ad populum is a pretty weak argument for a film's quality. And the thing is, this argument is actually more prominent than you may think. I have literally heard a radio show host say that American Sniper deserved the Academy Award for Best Picture because it made more money than all the Best Picture nominations combined, as though that is an actual gauge of whether or not a film is good. But perhaps the weirdest citation of box office returns to gauge a film's worth was with Captain Marvel. Although it's not so much citation as it is misreading and improperly observing data. See, there were a lot of people counting on this film to fail. A number of YouTubers constructed narratives for a full month that Captain Marvel was going to flop, based mostly on the fact that they didn't like Brie Larson. On opening weekend, however, Captain Marvel made $153 million. And over the course of its run, it would make $1.128 billion worldwide. That's a lot of money, even by the standards of Marvel Studios. This did not sit well for those who were predicting this film to flop, even though all legitimate data on tracking the picture clearly predicted that the film was going to be a success. A number of angry people went about trying to suggest that the numbers were fake. They didn't believe the $150 million opening gross and tried to find proof that it was inaccurate. Their initial response was that the box office results came in on Sunday and those were estimates. Those estimates must have been off, they argued. So, look, here's the truth. Yes, box office estimates are not 100% accurate when they come in on Sunday. Box office websites will often report the weekend earnings early on Sunday with a weekend estimate. Those estimates, however, are not just random guesses. They're based on the current income from Friday and Saturday, along with the projected foot traffic based on reserved ticket sales, and research data about how likely it is for audiences to go see that particular film that weekend. And yes, those estimates can be off, but the estimates are then corrected on Monday when the box office actuals are posted. The actuals tend to be a few million less or more than what was projected, but rarely do they exceed like a heavy number more than just like a few million. And FYI, the actuals for Captain Marvel that came in turned out to be slightly higher than the estimate. Some people actually tried to use photographic evidence that the seatings for Captain Marvel screenings were empty at their local movie theater. How could Captain Marvel possibly make over $150 million in its opening weekend when the theater was empty? The answer they wanted was that Disney was either buying up empty theaters or faking box office numbers. The real answer was that this was an unscientific sample size that proves nothing. Images like that could easily be faked, where screens playing lesser films could be captured and framed to be as Captain Marvel screenings. It could also be from a morning screening or late night weekend screening, where foot traffic is considerably lower. And even if we took the photos for their word, and the screenings were not filled at peak times, that would still not be a sufficient argument. There are roughly 11,800 movie theaters in the United States. Your one empty theater accounts for 0.008% of the total box office. It is not viable proof that the box office was off by thousands of millions of dollars. It would be like if I wanted to declare that Oreo wasn't America's best-selling cookie, by going to my local grocery store and finding that the packages have not been flying off the shelves. You understand why this logic doesn't support my claim, right? My one grocery store doesn't represent an entire national economic growth of a product that is in thousands of retailers. Oh, and for the record, Oreo is the best-selling cookie brand, but the lumped variety of independent bakeries actually accounts for a much larger profit than that of Oreo. I found that kind of neat, but I actually learned this by looking at the economic reports and statistical income analysis articles on that topic. I would never have arrived at that revelation if I did something as stupid as take pictures at my local grocery store. Because, really, all of this is just a pointless exercise of trying to prove that a movie is bad. And I've said this in other videos, but I'm going to repeat it here. If you don't like the movie, just say you don't like it. Because what point is there in trying to prove that a film is a box office flop? There are still people talking about Marvel's Shang-Chi as though it were a disappointment because it only earned $94 million over Labor Day weekend. Some columnists tried to argue that this was not a good opening weekend, as most Marvel movies opened to $100 million. But even if we took the pandemic and the decreased theatrical windows out of the equation, that is still a record broken for a film released on Labor Day weekend. Movies released on that weekend have historically had earnings way low. For reference, the previous record holder was 2007's Halloween, with a gross of $30.6 million. So Shang-Chi's $94.67 million is far from what would be considered a disappointment for that release date, even in pre-COVID times. However, none of this information matters to those who want to make this declaration of box office flops. They really just want to say that they didn't like the movie. And again, if that's the case, just say you didn't like the movie. Don't try to use the box office to justify your feelings for a film, especially when you're clearly ill-equipped to observe box office trends or read data properly. The box office is not a sufficient determinant of whether or not a film's quality is good or bad, because it's an observation more from a marketing and business angle than an artistic critique. Box office earnings ultimately hold little critical weight when it comes to discussing what is on the screen. It only matters if you allow it to matter, and nobody has to agree on those metrics with you. And that's why, when it comes to talking about the films I love, the box office numbers do not matter.
This movie is going to make a bunch of money week one because the marketing effort has been extraordinary. I mean, whoever's the marketing team over at Warner Brothers is doing an amazing job. Week one, this thing is going to clean up at the domestic box office. My prediction is going to just absolutely fall off a cliff after that. The repeat business on this movie is going to be non-existent.
The repeat business on this movie is going to be non-existent.